Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our faculty speaker series at Aspen University. Dr. Sadolski is continuing with this topic of threats of domestic terrorism, and this is his third presentation in the four-part series. His first part, he focused on just factors that are related to domestic terrorism. And then in part two, last time, he focused on things that are occurring on the southwest border, and he shared with us, and some of his research team also showed up and shared with us some images and some facts and details about IDs and passports they had found, and images of the wall and so forth that's being built or that exists there. And this time he's going to talk about specific terror groups and in particular things in the Middle East, which is always in our news. You can't really turn the news on without hearing that kind of stuff going on. So anyway, he's going to expand on that threat that's over there and how that really can, it seems to always be the spot for some reason. But I understand there's a lot of religious, of millennia and thousands of years of problems between different religious groups. And that seems to be a hotbed sometimes when people mix God with their beliefs, and as a result, they're not scared to die for their God, and they may act and commit acts of terrorism as a result of that, and justify it, with this belief that they're doing it in the name of God. So that's always a high risk area. It has been since I was a child. I can remember fights going on in the Middle East between the different groups, and it's again, today, and it's been really an effort of many of our presidents over decades to try to get peace in the Middle East. So Jared will share with us some of those risks and how that can actually, in today's context, you talk about something from 40 years ago, that's different than if you talk about it in today's world. And I even saw this morning there's some kind of unrest going on in South Korea where they've declared martial law. And these little fights that are going on can then expand real quickly when multiple groups get involved, and then it becomes a much bigger problem. So, Dr. Sadolski, I'll get out of the way and let you take over.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is an important topic. What's going on around the world impacts the United States. It impacts the United States in several different ways, but most concerning is the risk of terrorism. Recently, we've had the FBI director, who is actually on his way out the door, but we've had the FBI director, Christopher Wray, say in congressional testimony that lights are going off everywhere and that he doesn't recall a time in his career that there have been so many threats to the United States. And what he was referring to is the global unrest and how that increases the risk of terrorism in the United States. So, to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been with Aspen University for several years. I believe it's probably 5 or 6 years now. And so I am a criminologist. The main areas that I focus on are counterterrorism, counter human trafficking, and organized crime. So I spent 26 years with the Department of Homeland Security through the Coast Guard. Much of that time, especially after 9/11, was focused on counterterrorism. So I've been actively involved in counterterrorism operations, multi-agency task forces combating terrorism. I have been involved in critical infrastructure to prevent terrorism at a nuclear power plant, at the port of Miami, within the cruise ship industry, within the shipping industry. And I can tell you that before 9/11, nobody was thinking terrorism, right? So there was an attack on the USS Cole that Osama bin Laden was also responsible for. But it didn't happen on US soil. It happened in Yemen. So nobody was really thought that it would be possible, for our nation to be completely shaken to its core by a terrorist attack. When 9/11 occurred, it it brought everybody made everyone aware of the true dangers and evil that exists in this world and how evil people are willing to die in order to cause us harm. And the same threat that existed on September 10th, 2001 exists today. If anything, those risks have even increased. And we'll talk today about, why that occurs, why that occurred, and what can be done to mitigate it. But one important point I want to mention is an act of terrorism does not always look like 9/11. And as we talk about the threats that face the homeland from unrest around the world, it's really important to look at what could be an attack. And we're going to talk about what some of the current attacks that ISIS is using in other countries and how that could happen here. For example, we'll talk about their use of asymmetrical warfare, their use of technology, and their use of weapons of mass destruction that they're using around the world that is a real threat that could occur here. So let's delve into a little deeper about how the unrest in the Middle East can impact terrorism in the United States. So some of these ways that this can occur in is a risk of increased radicalization. Political instability, war, social unrest in the Middle East can contribute to the rise of these extremist ideologies. And social media is really a major conduit for extremism and radicalization, right? So you could have somebody that's sympathetic to Palestine, somebody that's sympathetic to Hamas, somebody that's sympathetic to Iran or Hezbollah, seeing what's going on, seeing that the United States is supporting Israel, and therefore could be inspired to conduct an attack here in the United States. That is one of the primary risks, that we face is there's people that are here in the United States. There's been over 10 million people that have come in illegally in the United States, many of which have been on the terror watch list. Many have been released and are currently in the United States and are on the terror watch list. There are people that have plotted attacks that fortunately we were able to detect and dismantle before they occurred by people that are sympathetic to their home country or the extremist ideology that exists in the Middle East. So you've got groups like ISIS, Al Qaeda, and others that use situations such as the turmoil between Israel and Iran as a tool or an opportunity to increase radicalization and to recruit. And it includes, exploiting grievances by people that are currently living in the United States in an effort to promote violence and terrorism as a solution in the United States. Terror organizations have a global reach. Middle Eastern-based terrorist groups can use unrest to further their reach way beyond the region they're in. So to include Western countries like the United States. So the way that they do this, so for example, ISIS in Afghanistan, is able to do this through the spreading of online propaganda and through encouraging individuals that sometimes have no direct connection to the Middle East to carry out attacks on US soil. The rise of lone wolf attacks where individuals self-radicalized and acted independently is a perfect example. They're looking at the propaganda that terror groups are putting out there online and putting out there on social media, and they're acting because of it, or they could act because of it, and that increases our risk of a domestic attack. So another factor related to the Middle East unrest and how that can result in terrorism in the United States is conflicts in the Middle East, such as the Syrian civil war, the rise of ISIS, and other foreign fighters, some of whom have been American citizens or residents. These individuals may return to the U.S. with combat experience, extremist views, and potentially a desire to carry out attacks. So the U.S. has a responsibility to monitor these returnees, but often they slip through the cracks. I can tell you, as somebody that has worked in Homeland Security for 2 decades, somebody that has spoken to people that are in charge of screening people coming into the United States, that these types of things get missed. These type of things slip through the cracks all the time, and that's if they come in legally. If they come in through the open, porous southwest border where 10 million people have come in, then they are able to come in. Basically, we don't know who they are. Well, we don't know who 2 million of those people are. So what I'm referring to into the context of the southwest border and how somebody from the Middle East that's sympathetic with a terror group or is part of a terror group So the ISIS network has a process for bringing people illegally into the United States. And if they can bring others from Central Asian countries by the thousands into the United States, well, that same ISIS backed smuggling ring can certainly bring a terrorist in or terrorists in without detection. They're currently in preparation for the change in the election. And speaking to a former Sinaloa cartel member, he explained to me that they're currently digging tunnels in places they don't traditionally do it, such as under the Rio Grande River, further east in Texas. They are anticipating, the change in the border policy in terms of being able to bring people in, and that they are acting accordingly. And one of the things that he shared with me, and again, this is somebody that was a Sinaloa cartel affiliate. He was a trafficker that worked in Southern California. He, prior to his incarceration for murder, he was actively involved in the trafficking of people. And he explained to me that after 9/11, there was a mandate amongst the cartels that no one from the Middle East that could be a suspected terrorist is permitted to be smuggled into the United States by the cartel because they didn't want another 9/11 style attack. And I can tell you that he told me recently that because of all of the splintering amongst the cartels, and now you've got all these people that are now involved in smuggling that weren't before because it's become very profitable for them the last 4 years. Well, he told me, he said that there is such a level of risk of terrorists being brought into the United States. It is higher than it has been since 9/11. So just imagine that somebody that was involved in trafficking of people, somebody who was involved with the Sinaloa cartel, explained to me that there's such a higher risk of a terrorist being brought in because they no longer care. There's no longer a hierarchy amongst the cartels that the boss says don't do it, therefore everybody falls in line and doesn't do it. It doesn't work that way anymore. The cartels have all splintered. They're all these smaller cartels that are different factions fighting each other. They don't care if somebody's brought into the United States from the Middle East as a terrorist to commit an attack. They don't care anymore as long as they get paid. So that's certainly one aspect of it. Terrorist financing is another. So unrest in the Middle East can often lead to unstable governments, ungoverned spaces, so which can be exploited by terror groups for fundraising and resource acquisition. This financial support can be used to fund operations, including targeting the U.S. and its interests abroad. So these groups engage in illicit activities, smuggling, extortion, money laundering to fund their operations. But a key point to that is the ungoverned spaces. That's a political way of saying a failed government. So let's look how many failed governments are around the world. There are, countries, well, a perfect example is Afghanistan, but I'll save that for last. But you could use, countries such as Haiti. Haiti doesn't have a government right now. It's run by gangs. Their president was killed a couple of years ago. Nobody's taken his place in a meaningful way. There was somebody named as the new prime minister, but he fled the country. So, we have lots of locations around the country, sorry, around the world that are failed states. There's no government structure. There's no law enforcement. There's no anything that prevents terrorists from operating with any type of threat of being disrupted. Best example is Afghanistan. The failure of the Biden-Harris administration to secure Bagram Air Force Base, to the manner in which they left Afghanistan cost many, many people their lives. It's not talked about, but it's a fact. And it was a failure in policy and the way that the withdrawal was handled, so much so that at the time, the Afghanistan, I think it was the prime minister, he fled the country because he knew that by the way that the government was pulling out of Afghanistan, that his government that was propped up by the U.S. government, by the U.S. forces, would immediately collapse. And it did. It collapsed that day. And there are those service members lost their lives, and the blood of those service members is on the Biden-Harris administration's hand. The statement comes from me personally. I'm not saying this on behalf of anyone else other than me as a military member who has served in the military for over 2 decades. I can tell you that the result of that withdrawal cost the lives of those military members. It's a fact. And So, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of Aspen or anyone else. This is coming from me personally. So, what happened next? Well, what happened next is the Taliban took immediate control and they immediately put their law back in place. So what's interesting is in that region, Al Qaeda, which is was defeated, it still exists, similar to ISIS. It was defeated, but it still exists in smaller factions. So the in Afghanistan, immediately they were able to take over Bagram Air Force Base. Well, the problem with that was there's billions of dollars of military equipment that we abandoned. So now they're driving our tanks, they're flying our airplanes. We gave the terrorists weapons. And it's just it's unacceptable and there's no accountability. And that's part of why I'm so frustrated is the lack of accountability. So the cyber terrorism and online radicalization we touched on, the digital age has certainly allowed for an increase in the reach of terrorist propaganda. Middle Eastern unrest often leads to online activity from extremist groups using social media, encrypted messaging apps. Telegram is currently widely used amongst terror groups to spread propaganda. Telegram's an interesting thing. So it's a Russian social media platform that's completely unregulated. They have ghost offices in different countries. But again, Telegram is real. People often wonder if it's real or not. I've seen it personally. I have seen children sold on Telegram. I have seen on Telegram messages of how to get into the United States illegally. I've even seen messages on Telegram about the US nuclear posture in a discussion written by Chinese nationals. So Telegram is one of the primary ways that they're using, they're spreading the propaganda. So move on to the next slide here. So defining terrorism, yeah, it's for some reason it's difficult to define, but the FBI's definition, violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups who have inspired or have associated with designated foreign terrorist organizations or nations that are state sponsored, right? So we'll talk in a second about which nations are state sponsors of terrorism. Iran is one of them. So, according to according to this other source, the calculated use of violence to create a general climate of fear in a population, and thereby to bring about particular political objective. Even that is narrow in scope because a lot of terrorism is religious, is environmental. There's environmental terrorism. There's a lot of different motivations for why somebody engages in terrorism. And I'm really hoping that there's a new definition that makes it a broader scope because, what does terrorism do? It incites fear, whether it's an act of terror or a threatened act of terror. It incites fear, it incites panic, it disrupts people's lives. And in the cases of actual attacks, it costs people their lives. And it's because of a certain objective or a certain ideology. That definition alone, if we were to use that, would fundamentally change how safe people feel in America. There have been hundreds of active shooter, mass shooter casualties in the United States each year. So that's defined as four or more people that are shot in one mass shooting incident. Well, we often label mass shooting incidents as that instead of what they really are, which is terrorism. And that occurs because the line is blurred on what the actual definition of terrorism is, which again, I think, especially with the heightened threat in the United States, there is no good reason not to provide a broader definition of terrorism, because when you do that, then you can designate groups that have an agenda that is, to bring about terror in the United States. You can list them on the foreign terror. You can list them as a foreign terrorist organization, and then therefore it unleashes a lot of government resources and laws to be able to enable those that are protecting us, our federal law enforcement and such, to actually target people. Best example are the cartels. Cartels are responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, more so than it is ever going to be reported. And yet we label them as a drug cartel, but they do far more. They bring in weapons. There was a recent case where a cartel in Mexico um, was investigated, and basically a stash house was taken down in Jalisco New Generation cartel, and they found military grade bombs. They found military grade equipment and weapons, yet we don't define, and they're fully responsible for terror acts, both in the United States and certainly in Mexico, that costs thousands of people's, hundreds of thousands of people their lives. Yet there's no, you know, there's opposition to labeling them as a foreign terrorist organization because they say that there's no political objective and that it's a financial objective. I understand that. But by changing the definition of terrorism, since there's so many out there, I think that could be done to encompass groups like cartels. So, international terrorism, according to the US State Department, they've designated over 60 groups as foreign terrorist organizations. The world's deadliest group, all the way to today in 2024, is still Islamic State, which is ISIS. So, it has been defeated in terms of removed from, its base of operations. But in light of, the Taliban operating Afghanistan, they're able um, to operate with impunity where the Taliban permits them to. So ideologies, secular beliefs, religious, ethnic discrimination, the factors that relate to international terrorism, misinformation, uh, conspiracy theories, and propaganda. There's a major power competition among terror groups, and it's interesting because we talk about the Taliban. So they don't get along well with ISIS or Al Qaeda, yet there's a financial incentive for them to control and operate, or at least operate in certain areas of Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, which obviously is run by the law provided by the Taliban, a terror group, one of those 60 terror groups, um, is able to allow these other terror organizations to flourish and to grow and to train. So Islamic State officially dismantled in 2019, with the fall of its last territorial holdings in Syria. However, it still exists. Jihadist groups that are sympathetic to ISIS. There are still ideological and organizational remnants of ISIS in existence, in particular in Afghanistan. But it still exists in different parts of the world. After all, there are still attacks occurring in the Middle East by ISIS. So the ideology of the global jihad, emphasizing the establishment as a caliphate and the fight against what they consider unbelievers, which would be us, the United States. And so ISIS has maintained a robust online presence, and again, encrypted communications. That includes WhatsApp. WhatsApp is commonly used by terrorist organizations because it's encrypted, and it's very difficult for anyone um, to engage to be able to read. So dark web. And the dark web's used to spread their propaganda. I actually went on the dark web once. It was part of a training course that I was in, and they were able to actually hack into it. And I could tell you that everything under the sun you could imagine is for sale there. Everything illegal, everything that immoral, everything that is pure evil. I saw most of, I shouldn't say everything, but I saw so many things on the dark web that were for sale. If you wanted to hire somebody for murder, that's easy. Drugs, any type of illicit drug you wish. Sex trafficking, it was all there. So the terror groups, use these dark web channels to spread their propaganda. So they're still able to operate in certain parts of Syria, Iraq, Libya, in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't think about Africa much, but they're able to operate there with impunity. So they exploit power vacuums, right? So areas that don't have a government that's regulating who's coming in and out of their country or what activities are being conducted in their country. So ISIS transitioned to a franchise model where local jihadist groups adopt the ISIS ideology and aren't directly controlled by their central leaders. They also retain a core of experienced fighters and military strategists who continue to engage in asymmetric warfare. Many parts of the world, um, again, that are underdeveloped or in some cases permit terror groups to operate within their countries are exploited by ISIS to continue to grow, to rebuild. There are state sponsors of terror, Cuba, which has been on that list for a long time. All of these countries have, but Iran. Let's talk about Iran for a second. So, you know, their funding of Hezbollah and their funding of Hamas and its war against Israel has, really been, in my mind, underreported and it's not been focused on as much as it should have. So, Iran is, we've given a lot of money to Iran in the last few years that, Iran is now funding terror groups to attack our allies. And Iran, they hate America. They've said death to America, yet we've provided them funding. And, Syria, which I consider a failed state. So North Korea, there is nothing, to maintain global peace, which is really what the United States should do. It's peace through strength. It's, North Korea, should be taken as a threat to our ally in the South Korea, which currently is engaged in martial law because of opposition to, I believe, their election. I think that occurred today. And so, it, these state sponsors of terror permit, the flourishing of terror groups within their countries. So, axis of resistance, I don't know why we changed that. It used to be axis of evil. To me, it's still axis of evil. So Iran, the Hezbollah is misspelled there, but efforts, to exploit the axis of evil have increased the threat of asymmetric attacks on U.S. soil. And so, I'll make sure I worded this correctly. So, yeah. So, um, experts believe that an attack by Hamas or Hezbollah on U.S. soil would benefit Iran, and it would. Any attack on the United States would benefit our, would benefit our enemies. So, these threats continue to grow. So this is something that I find that I found interesting. ISIS is using different forms of weapons of mass destruction, such as the mustard gas attacks they're responsible for. They're also using unmanned aerial vehicles extensively, and virtual reality has enabled these terror groups to use virtual training camps. How scary is that? So now, instead of satellite imagery being able to target terrorist training camps that are being permitted to operate in Afghanistan or in Syria or in another state sponsor of terror, virtual reality is being used by these terror groups to train. And that's not something we're able to track. You know, as I mentioned earlier, not all terror attacks look like 9/11. So, there are now online might not be the right word, but remote attack opportunities that terrorist organizations can engage in. You've got, biotechnology, you've got different ways that they could create an attack. Imagine, what would happen if, something as simple as, you name it, any major critical infrastructure, power was lost, and in a large way. I mean, it has happened. It shuts down 911 systems. It creates chaos. if telecommunications go down, you're not able to get a hold of your family, it creates, the chaos that they're looking for. So it's really important that we recognize the true threats, that exist. So you have, you have so many different ways that we could be attacked. You know that people have come into the country that are not accounted for. That's a fact, that are on the terror watch list. So I see it. I understand when FBI Director Wray says he sees lights going off everywhere, and there's never been a time in his career that he thinks that there's been a heightened level of risk for the United States in terms of an act of terror than right now. And a lot of it comes to the U.S.'s support of Israel, and it has increased the animosity and hatred um, of the countries that already hate the United States. So it's put us more on the map of being a target. And nothing can emphasize that more than this. Over 200 attacks and attempted attacks on US and global coalition forces have occurred since October of 2023. Sorry, October 23rd of 2023, which is when Hamas launched its attack on Israel. More than 200 attacks on our bases and on our coalition, our ally bases, yet very little, in my mind, nothing meaningful has been done in terms of holding those accountable for what has cost roughly 186 troops to either be injured or killed um, by attacks on US personnel in the Middle East, according to the Military Times. 186. Yet, where are the meaningful sanctions against Iran? What are we doing to hold these countries that are funding these terror groups that are killing our people? What are we doing to hold them accountable? Absolutely, in my mind, very little. And it if there could be 200 incidents of attacks, attempted attacks in the Middle East, across the Middle East, on U.S. bases and U.S. allies. If there's that much hatred to spend that much focus and time and money on attacking our bases, then what would prohibit them from moving the attacks on U.S. soil? And I fear that I don't believe another 9/11 is coming. I don't think it could. But if you had multiple denial of service attacks and multiple infrastructure attacks at once, it would impact far more people, in terms of um, potentially costing people their lives, but certainly creating, a sense of chaos in the United States. And it, the risks are there. People have come into the United States that hate America. When I was down in Mexico back in February of this year, and I was talking to some Russian nationals that were in Nuevo Progreso, Mexico, which is right across the border from Texas, just outside of McAllen, Texas. And I was talking to them, and they were there. They'd been smuggled there, and they were talking about how much they hate America. Imagine that. These people were being smuggled into America, but were telling me how much they hate America. And like I said, they were Russian nationals, and and a lot of that's because of Russian propaganda. But you know, it it's bizarre to me that we have allowed this level of risk to exist in the United States, when, at least when it comes to the border, it's a self-inflicted issue or self-inflicted wound. So it it I hope that these attacks, that the threat of these attacks are just that, they're threats, and nothing occurs. But the more unrest that exists in the Middle East, and the more turmoil there is, and the more the U.S. is involved, and I believe that they should be. I believe the United States has an obligation to support Israel, to protect Israel, and but and as that happens, we are going to continue to see the risk of an attack on US soil increase. Anybody have any questions?
Dr. Sadowski, thank you for that information. It's always fascinating to me, the amount of things that are going on in the world that we don't even know about, these 200 attacks on a, regular basis. We hear about some of them, but there's a lot that we don't hear about. And I'm sure sometimes that's the effort of the government to, not panic people. If you tell them too much than what reality is, and they might actually get scared. So you kind of muffle a lot of the information maybe in order to calm the masses. But before I sort of do my brain dump and share and ask questions, Dr. Beeman spent some time in the Middle East as a kid, or young adult, and I'm wondering, Nina, do you have any questions or comments or stories to share related to this topic?
Yeah, thank you for that. I have a very different viewpoint because I grew up in this area and I love the people of this area. Trying to turn on my video here. Yeah, there I am. I also currently act as a parish nurse and a medical interpreter for Arab speaking people who've come to this country to try to get away from this violence. These are humans, these are human beings. They love America, they want to be part of America. They're not all terrorists, I can tell you that. And they don't seek to overthrow our government, which is the definition of terrorism. I also know a lot of Afghanis that served us well in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, is not in the Middle East, it is in Central Asia. And they came here because they served us and that put their lives on the line. And so when they come to America, they're thrilled to be in a place that they have wanted to come to with people who, are happy that they're here. We in Virginia were one of the first places that a lot of the Afghani refugees came. We don't see them as terrorists. And I would say to you, because I'm a diplomat's daughter, that you're making 3 presentations on how we need to keep people out of our country. I would say to you, think about how maybe some of these countries would like to keep Americans out. I mean, if you take this American centric, version of we've just got to keep people who look like me in this country and keep foreigners out, think about that's maybe what the other countries are saying too, and that maybe there's a more peaceful alternative. So that would be my comment.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm referring to terrorists. That's what this entire topic has been about. I'm not referring to the people of the different Middle Eastern countries, or in the case of Afghanistan. I'm talking about the risk of terrorism. I'm talking about I'm talking about terrorists and the people that intend to do America harm. So working in Homeland Security, and working in different law enforcement roles. Going to your comment about keeping people out of the country, I am all for legal pathways. In fact, I support it. And so, but it's just that, it's legal pathways. And what we have right now are not legal pathways. What we have right now is 10 million people coming across the border that we don't know who they are. And while the vast majority of them, are coming for a better life, and I certainly understand and respect that, I'm not convinced that, our medical system, that we're able to sustain mass immigration, illegal immigration into the United States without regulation. Therefore, legal pathways are important. But I could tell you, somebody that has worked in law enforcement for over 2 decades, you have to know who's coming into your country. You have to know. And I could tell you, Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan gang that has come in, those guys don't belong here. They're coming here to commit crime. They are committing crime. So in no point am I saying that they have to look like you and I to come in to be in the United States. I never said that, not even close. I'm referring to terrorists and I'm referring to criminals that are creating a threat in the United States.
Yeah, and I understand that there are people from all over the world who's, that's how we were created, more or less. We were a nation of immigrants, and that's what made us such a unique country, and probably has been an asset of our country since we were created, was that we had such diversity, and we had people who came here, seeking a better life. And I understand that, when we say, that certain people are coming in, that we're not projecting that all the people who are coming in are of the bad group. So it is sort of this delicate balance that we have to consider when we talk about these kinds of topics. These are very, volatile topics, because people will take one side or the other. And sometimes it's hard to find a middle ground, you know what I mean? Because stuff that happens in the news that, can persuade people to think one way or another. But certainly we would have to agree that not 100% of everyone that comes into this country is seeking harm to our country. But we also have to agree that there is a portion of people who come into this country who are seeking harm. And what can we do to at least identify those people? The people who come here and work and don't cause problems and who contribute, we probably have less worry about those folks. But the people who come in and are, here to purposefully do harm, and to harm not only our government but our own citizens, those are, I believe, some of the things that we need to put in place to help eliminate or minimize that. It'll probably be something we can never 100% eliminate, because we have our own Americans who are terrorists too. It's not just outsiders. You look at all the school shootings, they're almost all Americans, white males in particular. And so, there's a lot of statistics that show it was something like 94% or something of all crime that's committed here is committed by Americans, not by immigrants. But, the 6% that does commit the crime gets, all the news. And so we have to, look at this in ways where is there a solution, and it almost has to be long term, where education and those kinds of strategies are helping minimize our risks of domestic terrorism. Something that just happened this week that made me stop and think too, where they were looking at X, which used to be Twitter. And they were saying, well, there's a lot of people who are moving away from X now, probably for a political statement, because, Elon Musk is involved, and he's, making statements, on a national level that they might not agree with. And so they're, out of protest, they're moving away from his platform into another platform. It was like Blue Cloud or Blue Sky or something like that. And so they're going to go away to that other platform in order to do, Twitter-like activity, and not be on Twitter. But the person who was talking about this phenomenon was saying, well, that actually can create more problems, because what happens now is people start isolating themselves off into specific social media platforms where they're only getting one type of message. They're only hearing what that one side of the view is all the time. And they don't get to hear the full perspective of opinions on a topic. And maybe in Twitter or X, you get to hear everything, even if you disagree with some of it. But once you move out of that now and go into another one because you're protesting what one side is doing, now you go into another platform where it's a different kind of message that you'll be getting. And therefore, it goes back to what Jared was saying, where a lot of these groups, these extremist groups, strategically and very expertly use social media, whether it be Telegram or WhatsApp or these other things, where they isolate people off. And once you isolate them, then you just feed them one kind of message, and they get brainwashed and propagandized into thinking a certain way. And to be honest, it's probably not hard to do that. It probably doesn't take very long for someone to belong to a certain group, ISIS or anything. It doesn't have to be an extremist group, to then start believing like that group when that's the only message you get. And in the old days, we used to always get our news from the television or radio, but mostly the television in my lifetime. And it was always these 3 or 4 national news channels: NBC, ABC, CBS, right? And it was hopefully you know, a variety of information that the viewer, the listener, could then come to a decision based on the full breadth of evidence or information available. But we've moved totally away from that, you know, and this was another thing that they said in the last election that created you know, the dissection, let's say, of the different voting groups, was that the different voting groups only were listening to one type of social media, something they belonged to, you know, one of these platforms, and they never examined all the rest of the sides. And as a result, they were only getting one piece of information, and they were believing that information as being true, whether it was or not. And so, you know, the terrorists can do that very easily, and that's one strategy they use. But it is something that worries me, you know, tremendously with artificial intelligence and et cetera. You know, the creator of ChatGPT said this is the greatest vulnerability of artificial intelligence is it can easily eliminate people's ability to make informed decisions, because it will only feed them the information. Oh, I like this, so I push a little arrow or a little happy face or a thumbs up or a heart or whatever it is in that social media to say I like something. And then all the algorithms now start feeding you more stuff like that. And they start giving you less stuff that's not like that. And therefore now all day long, all of your information, you can't get away from your phone. The stuff dings all the time, you know, and all of your social media apps, they're hitting you all day long with this information. And almost everybody, you can watch them in a public space, whatever they are doing, as soon as their phone makes a little ding noise, if there's a mess, they stop what they're doing and immediately look at it. So social media can captivate you and control the amount of time that you think about something, and it's incessant. And so this is, you know, Jared talked about this, the power of social media, and you know how it can persuade people to think in a certain way. And if we only get our news now from social media, we no longer go to these national sources that hopefully, you know, investigate, you know, the quality of the information they're presenting, and present both sides of a space. If we're only now going to one type of information that we agree with, then that becomes very dangerous. You know, that then becomes where people can easily get brainwashed to do evil, you know, through these terror groups. So, you know, Jared you talked a little bit about too, how there's certain countries that we know are sponsors of terrorism. But then also when you think about terrorism, it's not necessarily only associated with a specific country. And that's what makes it very difficult, in my opinion, to tackle terrorism, is it's spread across many countries. So where are you going to go bomb? You know, if one country does something to you, you have a territory that you can go wage war against, right? But if it's not associated with the country, it's just an ideology that exists across countries, and people who believe in that ideology, then it's harder to kind of attack it. You can't really do it through traditional warfare. You can't send in armies and tanks to fight something that's not associated with a single country. And sometimes these countries also don't want these people here, you know, they don't want these terrorist groups in their country, but these terrorist groups exist. And then what do? Go bomb that country, you know? So it's complex. And it's the same with, like, right now, you know, Hamas and Hezbollah, whether or not you think or believe they are, you know, government sponsored by the country that they live in, you know, that becomes a different topic, because are you going to now go bomb, you know, these countries when they might not want those people there either? So when you have a country to attack, it's easier, I think, to fight the war. When you don't have a country to attack, then it's harder to fight this phenomenon of terrorism. The other thing, and Jared talked a little bit about this too, is I think the nature of warfare is totally different now. You know, it's not armies against armies. You know, I heard one time that they said terrorism is the tool of the poor. Countries have armies. Countries have, you know, military. They have weapons, and they have bombs, and they have tanks. Terrorists do not. Terrorism is the weapon of the poor. That's the only way they can fight the dominant, you know, countries who can easily militarily destroy them. They do it through acts of terrorism, these small little one-off, events. But I also think terrorist groups are very well funded, often by these, government-sponsored terrorist organizations. And you think about terrorism, like, why would it exist if you're dying? You go blow yourself up. It's not a very good strategy, to be honest. Over the long run, everybody's going to be on your side, is going to be dead because they've blown themselves up, to make a statement. But these things are highly funded. These terrorist organizations are getting lots of money in order to be able to provide for these terrorists. They go to these terrorist camps and so forth. Somebody has to provide them with food. They have to have guns to shoot. They have to have bombs, made and so forth. And that all costs money. And so they have money to now do this next level. And I see this a lot where we hear it also in the news, but you see it happening over in the Ukraine. And I also heard, the Israelis are using this strategy as well, where it's not people anymore. It's not people fighting people. It's robotics and machines. It's drones, really. It's these little drones, not only these big drones that we hear about where it's a a camera guided missile kind of drone, the missile's as big as a truck, and it flies like an airplane, and they just drive it with the camera and drive it right into where they want to bomb it instead of just shooting something and hope it lands where it's supposed to. But it's also these smaller drones, these drones like we have for recreation, where you have this little small helicopter thing that it's no bigger than maybe a small box, but you fly it around and, and it's fun to take pictures and see things from above. But those now are starting to be used as bombs. These things that have these little small drones which can't be picked up by radar. They're harder to shoot down because they're just tiny and they're small and they fly through space undetected. Those are the kinds of things now that terrorists are using. Even here in the US, there was something I saw not too long ago in the news where they were talking about this constant, incessant pestering of military bases with hundreds of drone incidences daily, where these little small drones are just flying around, Air Force bases and other military bases in the US, just taking pictures and seeing what they can get away with and seeing what they can be, what can be seen. That's a very low effort terrorist attack, in my opinion. If you can just ship a box of drones over to the US or order them online from Amazon or something, and then get them and equip them with some kind of explosive or other kind of, bomb, then you can do a lot. You can fly those drones into things and blow up a lot of stuff. So that's where I also see a lot of this moving to. I really don't think it's people flying airplanes into buildings and stuff like that anymore. That could be a small effort, just to do a very small terrorist attack. But I think it'll be this mass quantity of drones where there's thousands of these things flying around, above cities, in cities, not even above cities, in between buildings, and go rest on top of a building overnight and get back up and fly it again in the morning. That's really where warfare, I believe, is going. And once it goes there, then it's cheap. The terrorists will be able to do that. They can't afford a Scud missile. They can't afford, an Apache helicopter. They can't afford, a stealth bomber. These things are billions of dollars, millions and billions of dollars. But they can do these low effort attacks, the things that I said that are like drones. But going back to the border a little bit, President-elect Trump just this week, I believe, or last week, it still is going on this week, you hear it in the news, in order to get some control over the US border, has now threatened on his first day, I'm guessing, Canada and Mexico. Canada, of all people, you would think that they're our friends, but a 25% tariff on all their goods if they don't do something to secure the border. Now, I agree we got to work together with everybody, but sometimes these efforts may actually, backfire on us if that's the strategies. You're going to put a tariff on our neighboring country in order to force them to put more effort into preventing, these groups of people. Most of it comes from Mexico, where there's caravans of 3,000 or 4,000. You don't often hear that coming over in Canada. But our guest, one of our guests from last time mentioned that it's not the Southwest border that's the biggest threat, it's the Canadian border, because no one regulates that at all, and there's so many areas of Canada that's just remote and isolated that there's no humans out there to even monitor it. Now, again, you'd hope that satellites and drone technology that's flying over can spot these people, and it may be more of an electric wall, a digital wall than anything. But those are the risks of having such a big border that's unmanned, is you can't monitor what's happening there. And therefore, as soon as the terrorists realize, oh, they're going to put a lot of effort on the Southwest border, well, fine, we'll just go in through Canada and we'll just infiltrate that way. It's like we take our eye off the ball, and then they go and do a different tactic. But the last thing that to me that Jared talked about, which again I think is a greater threat than bombs, is a cyber terrorism, because it is true, once you attack someone's systems and you shut the systems down, or worse yet, you take the systems over and now you control them, then that is far more devastating than dropping a bomb on people. If you don't have electricity, nothing functions in your life. You can't go to the bank and get cash to go buy anything. You can't go to the grocery store because everything works on computers. You can't go get gas at the gas station. You can't do anything. There's going to be no heat, no air condition. There's going to be no lights, no refrigeration. Hospitals and things like that need, you can sit there and say they run off of generators, but you're going to need gasoline, and so if the gas pumps don't work because there's no electricity. So to me, it's those kinds of acts of terrorism that are going to do far more devastating disruption than an airplane, flying into something. So that's kind of my brain dump on the topic today, Jared. Any final comments before we get off? Because I know next time you're going to, in the fourth and final step of the series, you're going to talk more about what can be done to address some of these concerns related to, potential threats of domestic terrorism and our borders not necessarily being secure.
This is Nina. I'll just make one quick
Go ahead,
comment.
Nina.
Love people from the Middle East because they are very tight in the mosque. And it's very likely that if they heard about a potential terrorist attack, they would see something and say something, because most of them, I'll say, are very loyal Americans. So you have not wasted love on Middle Eastern people, because it will come back and probably protect us.
Yeah, and you hope in every group, good will always prevail, that the good people in those groups will say something and will notify. And we have to believe that some of our intelligence relies on these informants that are working within these groups and want good to come out and don't want to be associated with these kinds of acts. But again, there are these bad people that exist, and unfortunately, in some of these countries where they exist, they are, through brute force and intimidation and murder and kidnapping, they get the general community to comply, or to at least remain quiet. That was one thing that I didn't understand about, over in, the Hamas and Gaza. I thought, if the Palestinians would just start notifying everybody where these Hamas leaders and where there's, their cache of bombs and stuff are, and turn them over to the authorities, not the authorities in that country, you'd probably have to turn them over to the Israelis, then maybe the war would have stopped sooner. But because they weren't necessarily cooperating for fear of their lives from the Hamas terrorists, then the war continues to go on. And it can be probably said about Hezbollah the same way. If the Libyans were, was it Libya? No, it's not Libya. Is it Libya where Hezbollah is? I don't remember. But if the folks of that country started saying, I know where a terrorist group is, I know where they are keeping their guns, I know where they're doing this and that, and the authorities were coming and confiscate that stuff, you would eliminate these pockets of these groups, and therefore you'd eliminate the attacks on your country, because a lot of the citizens get, you know, destroyed in these bombs. It was almost like what we did with the mafia. You know, you had to get people in the mafia to turn on the mafia in order for us to go in and figure out where they are and eliminate them. It has to be a little bit like that. You have to treat terrorism like organized crime. You know, you have to sometimes follow the money to figure out where, you know, who's in charge and who's doing things. But if the people in those societies, if the people like Nina's saying that are the good people that are saying we aren't associated with this, we want to help and support, and we believe in peace and love and not hate and, you know, and death. If there's far more of those good people in those societies than there are bad people. I think in every society, that's a very small portion of people who are bad. But many people are bullied, just like from the mafia, to be quiet, because I don't want to say anything. If I say anything, they're going to target me or my family or whatever. And therefore, they're part of the problem through their silence. And if they would just say something to the right people, then sometimes, you know, you can get in there and dismantle that organization by you know, attacking their individual places where they hide things, or the people who are involved in the planning and leading these organizations. But you have to get cooperation from the general public. In other words, like Nina said, if they see something, they need to say something. And I know Jared has said that before as well, in terms of anything that happens here, is when we see something, we need to say something and not be quiet. But I think, again, sometimes our silence contributes to the problem.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like I said, you know, what is being allowed to occur at the southwest border is so inhumane in terms of, you know, I'll leave you with this. Yeah, and you know, to be very clear, I didn't say that, you know, nobody should be allowed to come into the United States. I didn't say anything close to that. What I said was we need a secure border. We have created a pathway for children to be trafficked in in the United States. I've testified before Congress about it, seen it, I've lived it. And I've seen many cases of people that are being sold in the United States because of the open borders. And in fact, I've been on the border to where I've walked the trails that cartels bring people through, and I see the signs of sexual exploitation of women and children. I've seen that. And then we've gone and testified. 2 weeks ago, we testified, my partner testified about our findings and how people were being so exploited because of the current policies that is fostering people from coming all around the world to risk their lives to come into the United States because of the current asylum program. And you know, I was in a shelter in McAllen, Texas, filled with migrants, talking to every one of them. I'm sorry, to everyone that I talked to had in some way been victimized, exploited, hurt by the cartel. In fact, there was a mother who refused to let a child out of her arms because she explained that the cartel stole not only all of her belongings, but the other two children that she started the voyage with because she had no money for bribes. So, you know, this current policy on the border is, in addition to increasing the risk of terrorists coming into the United States, is costing people their lives. And, you know, I go down into Central America, I interview traffickers that are incarcerated, and I hear their thoughts. You know, I hear, you know, how they, you know, how prior to their incarceration, they were exploiting what was going on at the southwest border in terms of how many people are able to come in freely. And it is unfortunate. And yes, a lot of people are coming for a better life, and I support that. But you have to have a border. You have to know who's coming into your country in order to protect it.
I think that is certainly the truth. You know, we do have to have some knowledge of who's coming here, not necessarily to keep everybody out, but again, they should do it through the legal methods so that we can know who they are, and we can also make sure we have enough resources to support them, depending on how many people we admit. But at the same time, there are certainly some bad people mixed in with the good people. The majority of the people are good, but there'll be a small portion that are going to be bad, and those small portion can do a lot of damage when you get a lot of those people over time, you know, coming into a country with intent to do harm. Yeah, I'm thankful that I'm not in their situation. I'm thankful that I don't live in a country where I'm willing to risk my life and that of my children, knowing that I'm going to have to be, have these coyotes who work for cartels transport me and smuggle me into a country. Think of how bad their life is in that country that they're willing to go do that.
Fair
And
point.
we don't have that perspective because we never have lived in a country like that. Maybe we did live in a country, but that was similar in ways, but we weren't stranded in that country. People that are born in those countries where there's so much corruption and the cartels are, in bed with the government and the government supports and allows the cartels to function because they're probably paid off millions of dollars by the cartel. Corruption is probably the number one thing that promotes terrorism. Corruption in these government levels that allow it to go on, or fear that the terrorists are going to attack them, or the terrorists just give them millions of dollars. It's that corruption in the government levels that really allows some of this stuff to happen on the mass scale. There's also governments like Jared mentioned that just don't like the United States, and they're going to associate with terrorist groups just because the terrorist groups will help cause chaos for us. And it helps that foreign government's agenda. Whether or not that foreign government is a terrorist group, they may sometimes support the terrorist groups just because it's another thorn in our side.
Yep.
Jared,
And
go
speaking
ahead.
about, yep, so a Central American country that I've been doing humanitarian work for the last 5 years. I go all the time. I was going once a month, now it's about once a quarter. But I went there a couple of years ago, it's probably 22 or 23. And I said I was riding with the police and we were going through this gangland, basically just full of gang members. There's, I think, 12 different competing gang groups within this community. And maybe it was a little earlier, maybe it was 21, late 21. And I'd asked the police, I said, well, where are all the gang members? There's nobody here. And he said, well, we told them all to go to the United States. So, you know, it, those guys are in the United States today because they were smuggled here, they came here, and all they know is crime. So it's not like they came to the United States and got a PhD. You know, it is true, that people are flushing their criminals into the United States because of the open borders the last 4 years. I've seen it.
Yeah, I know that Fidel Castro did that like in the 80s when he emptied
Yeah,
all
Mariel Boatman.
the prisoners, yeah, into southern Florida. It certainly is a tactic, I'm sure, that's used by governments to cause grief for other governments that they may see as an enemy or a threat to them. Okay, it's a very, very complex topic. There's so many layers to this, and there's so many sides, and there's so many views, and there's so many pieces of information that have to be considered in order to correctly and humanely and intelligently solve this problem. I don't think there's a single solution that's going to fix this, and it's been going on for many, many, many years, and many, many different kinds of presidents and different kinds of political parties that immigration continues to be at the top of the list of ever presidential election since I've been a kid, where they've talked about people coming over. But if you think about it, back in the early 1900s and so forth, I'm sure everybody said the same about the Irish immigrants and the Jewish immigrants and the Italian immigrants when they were all first coming over and flooding into New York. I'm sure there was this anti-immigrant stance in those days too, over 100 years ago, when it was just this foreigner is here and they're a threat to us. But in those days, we didn't have terrorism in the same level as we do today. So I think that's one thing that Jared's emphasizing is that, letting people in is one thing, but letting people in who have the intent of doing harm. Most of the people who came over in the early 1900s to Ellis Island, they were here to get a better life, and they came with that attitude. Nowadays, it's not all those people are coming in with that perspective. Some are coming here intentionally to do harm. So I definitely think securing our borders in a way that is smart is necessary in order to minimize potential threats in the future. Because once a terrorist act happens, you can't unhappen it, right? You can't undo it.
Right.
We can't undo 9/11, you know, so we can go back and say, well, we sure wish we had done this and that. Well, it's too late. You know, something tragic has happened. And you know, it could be certain things like even a coup. It doesn't have to be a bomb. It could be, you know, that there's just so much social unrest that the people now take over governments, and it isn't a terrorist group that does it. You know, you're seeing that, like we were saying, in South Korea right now, and over in Syria, there was something went on this past weekend where these rebel groups are taking over cities because they're just getting tired of things associated with their government. So, you know, it's going to be delicate times, I believe, for all of us who are alive today. Over the next, you know, 5 to 10 years, it's going to still be touchy waters for us to live in, whether it be terrorism or threats of, you know, global war. These are not necessarily good times to be living in those terms, but we've got to somehow think this through and come together and come up with a solution that you know, serves people in a humane way while still eliminating the threat. I wish I knew the answer, you know, but maybe Jared will talk more about that next time. But sometimes you have to think there has to be some kind of divine intervention at some point, because we as humans don't seem to be able to handle these kinds of challenges. We often are the contributors to the problem. You know, you look at every problem that exists on the planet, it's all human caused in reality, one way or another. Okay. Anyway, a very, very, very fruitful discussion today. And obviously we went over time. It was so engaging, the topic, that we spent more time in our Q&A today than normally. So Jared and Nina, we'll see y'all again in a couple of weeks.
Stay safe.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.